Existentialism is a somewhat nebulous movement in continental 20th century philosophy, which has its roots in the 19th century. The two most important precursors to existentialism were Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and it turns out, fortunately, that I recently lectured on these two, so you probably remember some of it. And it's kind of strange that two figures, in many ways as different as Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, should both be precursors to the same intellectual tendency. Nietzsche thought he was the Antichrist. He thought he was the end of Western philosophy. He thought he was the final death blow to theology and to theism. Kierkegaard thought that he was the ultimate Christian, who was willing to sacrifice all of reason, all of logic, the entire Greek tradition to Christianity. What do they have in common? How is it that these two are seen as the precursors, and what could these two possibly be the precursors to? Well, there's a certain similarity between the two. First of all and foremost, they are individuals. They choose and they judge, and they don't ask anyone's permission. They make their decisions and are willing to make their commitments independent of other people's opinions and independent of any of the previously received canons of rationality. This is particularly important. Both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are apostles of moral heroism, or in the case of Nietzsche, perhaps immoral heroism, but heroism at any cost and heroism in any case. And this is one of the most important elements in 20th century existentialism. And in particular, what Nietzsche and Kierkegaard emphasize is the idea that the individual must confront a world that is essentially chaotic and make choices that are essentially without criteria. The fact that we must agonize our way through an obscure and unclear human condition, that we must make choices of the utmost gravity without any good rational foundation, is the agony of the human condition. And Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, those great individuals, were the two that forced us to start thinking about the agony of individual choice, the heroism that's required to stand outside of received wisdom, even to stand outside of reason itself. Now, in the 20th century, there are a number of borrowings from the tendencies more than the actual writings of these two. And in existentialism, we see primarily a group of German and French thinkers who tried to articulate the predicament of human beings in the 20th century. We are a group of people, or we are a culture on the whole, that no longer takes religion terribly seriously. We, in some respects, have outgrown mythological accounts of the world, and yet we still need to do some of the things that religion used to do. We need to make judgments about right and wrong. We need to make decisions about how to live our lives. And we need to find some way of being really human in an age that seems set against us discovering an effective individuality, of being something other than a cipher and a social security number. In other words, existentialism is a philosophical movement loosely organized with no particular set of dogmas, except that individuals must confront their condition without any palliative, anything that prevents you from confronting the pain and the anguish of making decisions that have no good grounds. Now, probably the most important 20th century existentialist philosopher is Martin Heidegger. And those of you that have read Heidegger before will probably find him as baffling as everybody else does when they first encounter him. But it's not the kind of bafflement, it's not the kind of puzzlement that we find when we read someone like Wittgenstein. When you read something like the Tractatus, the puzzlement that you get is the fact that you must move through this with extreme care, word by word, sentence by sentence, line by line, because everything connects in a totally coherent mathematical order. The puzzlement that we get when we read Heidegger is in the kind of language that he uses, in the kind of terms that he coins, and most especially in the kind of questions he asks. What's most intriguing about Martin Heidegger is not so much the answers that he gets, because I think that you'll find when you read his book there isn't a lot in the way of answers, but there's all kinds of intriguing questions in Heidegger, and that's probably his most important contribution. Now, Heidegger says that we have to deal with Dasein, and you will spend an endless amount of time chasing your tail trying to figure out what Dasein is, because Martin Heidegger is never going to tell you. He's beyond definition. He's taken the opposite extreme from the tendency that we see in Anglo-American philosophy towards increasing precision. He's going to go for increasing global comprehensiveness. He's going to try and articulate the things that Wittgenstein and the logical positivists said can't be articulated or even thought about. Dasein for Heidegger is the, I don't know, it's hard to define, but let's try this. It's the mode of human existence in the world. And what I mean by the world is not the world of space and time, not the world of the positivists, but the human world. The world of judgments, of commitments, of connections, the social world of human life, rather than the world, strictly speaking, of space and time, the human world we're talking about here. This, I think, is what Wittgenstein was gesturing at the end of his career, when he talked about languages being connected to forms of life. Different forms of life taken together would form Dasein, which is the way it is to exist as a human being in a world of meanings as opposed to a world of objects. Now, what Heidegger wants to do is figure out what Dasein is. In other words, figure out what it means to be a human being. He's going to ask the big questions. In that respect, he's the heir to the German and continental philosophical tradition that wants global coverage and is sometimes willing to risk logical precision in order to get a complete and comprehensive treatment of the human condition. And the difficulty that Heidegger encounters, or that he says that we must all encounter, is that simply by being human, simply by addressing Dasein, simply by being what people are, we are compelled to ask fundamental questions. For example, what is being? What is it to be a human being? We are compelled to address issues and ask questions that we know in advance have no satisfactory answers. So we're in an anguish state, forced to ask questions that we can't answer, and forced to deal with the fact that there is no escaping the question except through evasion, except through a rejection of what it means to be a human being. So we're almost able to be what we want to be. We've camped out just outside the gates of paradise. We never really get any final answers, but we can't avoid asking ultimate questions. And that is the human condition, according to Heidegger. That's what's involved in Dasein, when you fundamentally confront what it means to be a human being. Can you see the connection here to someone like Kierkegaard? Right? If you think about the fact that we don't ultimately get satisfactory rational answers, in Kierkegaard's case it causes him to ignore the tradition of rationality, to get rid of it as an impediment. Instead, Heidegger says he's not going to go towards a religious pseudo-resolution to the problem. He's going to maintain intellectual respectability by dealing with the fact and confronting the fact and writing a book, or writing a number of books about the fact that we must ask the big questions and we have only little answers. So Heidegger leaves us in a kind of limbo. And this limbo is what it means to be really human, what it means to be really conscious. Now Heidegger also says, and he uses technical terms very frequently, that we must confront Befindlichkeit. What Befindlichkeit means is the feeling of being just thrown out into a world that we neither create nor comprehend, and that we must deal with it willy-nilly, like it or not. The consequences of facing an incomprehensible world that has no moral structure, it has no ontological structure, it has no logical structure, it has no structure at all, simply one experience after another. The consequence of that is he calls Sorge, which in German means fear or worry or care. And in other words, Heidegger says that the universal human condition, or the universal human emotion, when we see ourselves for what we really are, is dread. Now that's a page torn directly from Kierkegaard. The concept of dread, the dreadful circumstances that we find ourselves in, the worries that attend being really human and really being a conscious agent, all come together to tell us that what we are is uncertain. What the world is even less certain. And the best we can do is muddle through, but there are better and worse muddling throughs that have rather uncertain qualities. So it is a philosophy which almost makes a virtue of uncertainty, which not only never gets to any final conclusions, but in fact says that that's the idea. Heidegger says that philosophy is always unterwegs. What that means is underway. In other words, philosophy is always on its way towards somewhere, which is like, imagine taking a trip, but not ever getting where you're going. Now imagine that that's not a problem, but that's the idea. It's a kind of perverse view. It's the sort of view that you would get, to be honest, from broken-hearted idealists. That is to say, when we can no longer take metaphysics and the second world and the Platonic realm of the form seriously, when it looks like positivists are going to carry the day, the would-be idealist, like Heidegger, holds back and decides, no, the world is a lot more complicated, the world is a lot more uncertain, the world is a lot more trying than any positivist could ever imagine. This is the reason why typical themes in existentialism are not the location of particles or the properties of electrons or any scientific question at all. The typical question for an existentialist is fear, worry, anxiety, psychological states that Wittgenstein, or at least the early Wittgenstein, and other positivistic thinkers can't even ask, much less answer. The reason why the positivists can't ask or answer questions about psychological states is that they've essentially abolished the psyche. There's nothing to talk about. So your fear, your terror, your worries, your hopes, your lusts, unscientific, not for real philosophers. The existentialists stand that tendency on its head. They say, no, this is what philosophy is all about. Heidegger, in fact, has an extremely strong technophobic tendency. Those of you who have ever read his essay on the question of technology, we'll see here a real technophobia, a shying away from science and technology because it interferes with our recognition of what we are. It gets in the way of Befindlichkeit. All the gadgets and all the tinkering that we can do with physical reality prevent us from realizing that the human condition is uncertain. It has no limits. There are no rules. The pseudo-security that we get from science and techniques is in fact a danger to our achieving the self-consciousness of what we really are. And that's what Heidegger is about. And in that respect, you can see this as an extension and extrapolation of the German and continental tradition. Self-consciousness is the big deal for Hegel. Self-consciousness is the big deal for someone like Plato. But Heidegger takes that and takes the inability of finally describing the human condition and says, that's going to be my description of the human condition. So he's going to outflank the positivists. If the early Wittgenstein and people like him wish to say that there's nothing that can be sensibly said besides physics and logic, well then what Heidegger and other existentialists of that technophobic stripe are going to do is delegitimize the discourse of the logical positivists. Better a hellish silence than a purgatory full of scientists. The Germans are going, Heidegger is going to release us from that problem. We're not going to have to think about that anymore. Instead, we can absorb ourselves in the anxieties and the difficulties of the human condition. We can confront Dasein and at least live the best possible nihilistic way that we can. We're given a choice of nihilisms. This particular one seems to be the nicest, the best, the most authentic. There's a set of jargon for each existentialist, but what it really refers to is understanding the fact that there's not a great deal that we can understand and dealing with the fact that there's not a great deal that we can deal with. So Heidegger articulated a critique of Western philosophy which says that all the solutions alleged to have been created in the whole history of the West are in fact pseudo-solutions. In fact, there is no solution to the problem of human being. You must confront Dasein and lump it, deal with it. There's nothing anybody can do with that. All the alternatives are worse. All of them involve self-deception. And if we can't be perfectly knowledgeable, we can at least avoid deceiving ourselves. If we can't ever completely comprehend the universe, we can at least prevent it from being less comprehensible than it would be otherwise. At least we can avoid deceiving ourselves, no matter what the limitations of the human mind are. Now, what Heidegger does is he tries to force us back prior to the Western tradition of metaphysics, prior to the Socratic absolutization of certain nouns into metaphysical constructs, which Heidegger believes has led us astray. The temptation to metaphysics is the big wrong turning point that Western philosophy takes, and the consequence of that is that we are stuck looking for answers in some eternal realm, independent of space and time, independent of the real human condition, and these are fictions which prevent us from understanding our limitations. Now, what Heidegger wants to do is to force us back to rethink our problem. He wants to force us back to essentially the pre-Socratic conception of the world, where at least we are not obscuring the ambiguities and difficulties of our condition with a pseudo-answer, with a series of mythological entities like the Platonic forms. So Heidegger can be thought of as the greatest of the modern pre-Socratics. It's not an accident that he likes Anaximander and Anaximenes and Heraclitus as much as he does, and it's not an accident that much of his written work has been connected with an analysis of pre-Socratic physics and pre-Socratic ethics. Much of his concern is to try and undo the damage done by Socrates, who represents the will to know, the will to rationality, the will to certainty. All illusions, pernicious, have to be gotten rid of. Now, Heidegger, in Being and Time, tried to discuss Dasein, tried to explain to us what it was like to be a human being and what it was like to live in the kind of world that human beings have. Note here that instead of describing the external world the way the Anglo-American tradition will, instead of being concerned primarily with the location of things outside of us, this is an almost entirely inward-looking philosophy. It's largely a matter of indifference to them how the physical world works, and logic is an entertaining thing for undergraduates to learn, but real philosophers aren't particularly concerned with it because there is no ultimate solution to the problems that philosophy is forced to confront, and there is certainly no logical solution. There is no way that you could do a series of logical proofs and find out how you're supposed to behave. There is no way for you to create a logical algorithm which will allow you to choose just political systems as opposed to unjust political systems. You take your best shot. Don't try and create any theory which accounts for it, because there is no such possible theory. Commit yourself and go for it. It's a philosophy of individual choice. The difficulties with this sort of approach to philosophy, I think, are obvious. Someone once asked Robert Frost why he didn't write free verse, why he kept the idea of rhymes and a kind of form to his poetry. And he said, writing free verse is like playing tennis with the net down. And philosophy without rules that is entirely subjective is an awful lot like playing tennis with the net down, because everything is in. Now, what they give with one hand, they take with the other. Someone like Heidegger, when he says that there is no ultimate solution to the problems of human beings, also tells you that you must confront Dasein, because that's something important for you to do. Or he'll invent some kind of lingo which accounts for it. But in fact, he can't go beyond the limitations of his own subjectivity. To a great extent, the existentialists, when you read them, especially over a period of time, and you absorb what they're trying to drive at, they sound like people who are talking to themselves. And that accounts for a good bit of why it's very hard to comprehend what they're driving at. And in addition to that, it also accounts for the very poetic nature of existentialist writings. And in fact, their emphasis on anxiety and worry and care and uncertainty, on all extreme psychological states, is in fact the stuff of poetry more than philosophy. Perhaps Wittgenstein in his early phase was wrong. Perhaps what we cannot speak about, we don't have to pass over in silence. Perhaps we have to move from science to art. Perhaps we move from logic to poetry. Essentially, Heidegger's work, like Being and Time, and the work of Sartre and the other existentialists, are hymns to becoming. They are poems about subjectivity, and in that respect, they connect up as much with the literary tradition of the 20th century as with the philosophical tradition. The borderline between poetry and philosophy in existentialism is a very murky one, and that has to do with the logical structure of this system, but it also has to do with the fact that what they are doing transcends all boundaries, and in fact is antagonistic to the idea of boundaries at all. What is it that Allen Ginsberg says? Take the doors off the jams and take the jams off the walls. Undo all structure. Deal with just yourself. Make your judgments and take your best shot. Heidegger was very influential. One of the most important German thinkers of the century, and many of his students went on to become existentialists. And like Kierkegaard and like Nietzsche, there are no two identical existentialists. They change because they are all individuals, because this is a philosophy which says, be an individual. Make your own judgments. Don't try and create some pseudo-solution to problems that can't be solved. There is no ultimate grounding for our judgments of right and wrong. There is no ultimate foundation for the thinking that we do and the actions we undertake. Stop that project. Instead, get people to confront the fact that there are no rules, that the doors have been taken off the jams, like it or not. Willy-nilly, we have to confront that. Now, the work of Jean-Paul Sartre, he lives a little bit later than Heidegger, and it's an extrapolation from Heidegger. It's much more readable, and to be honest, there are few things as unreadable as Heidegger. And he asks similar kind of questions, but he is more accessible, and you will probably find that most of the questions that get asked in Heidegger also get asked in Sartre, but they get answered in a way that's more readily absorbable. So if you're going to be reading Existentialist, try Sartre first. And if you're going to be reading Sartre, try his literary works first before you go to the actual philosophical works. Think of the kinds of questions that somebody like Heidegger wants to ask. Instead of asking the way a scientific philosopher does, what sort of things exist, Heidegger wants to ask the question, what is there for things to be? And of course, when you phrase the question not about the things that are, but about what it means for something to exist at all, you have stepped into the philosophical deep water, and there's no telling if we're ever going to find the bottom. In fact, Heidegger's argument essentially tells us that there is no bottom to such questions, but we must ask, what is it for something to be? Heidegger doesn't want to know what sort of things human beings know, but what is it to know something? He doesn't want to know what sort of things we can think about. He wrote a whole book called What is Called Thinking, that just examines what it means to think anything, regardless of what you happen to put in your head. That's not nearly so important as what it means to have anything in your head at all. So he changes the structure of thought by changing its orientation. Instead of trying to describe with ever-increasing precision the external world, we're going to try and describe with whatever precision is possible the world of the human psyche. Not what do we know, but what is it to know anything. Not what is it that exists, but what is it for anything to exist. What are we talking about when we talk about existence? And Heidegger says that in the long run, all of our attempts to answer questions like that end up as silence. And here's where Sartre takes off from Heidegger. He tries to answer questions that Heidegger leaves us in silence, or that the positivists leave us with in silence. Sartre tries to answer the question of what it means to be a human being in the 20th century in poetic terms. Sartre's best work, I think far and away, are his novels and plays, because they offer a poetic instantiation of most of the main concepts in his philosophy in a way which is not just accessible, but which actually puts it at its most favorable advantage. So questions of anxiety, questions of uncertainty, questions of the undecidability of the human problems are what concerns Sartre in the novels that he writes, in the plays that he writes. Now, Sartre says, essentially, that what makes human beings human and what makes them different from everything else in the world is that they're free. We are condemned to freedom, according to Sartre. And what that means is that we are forced to make choices that have no logical grounding, and that there is no way to avoid that condemnation to freedom without self-deception. In Sartre's language, that means a lack of authenticity. We ought to be authentic. We ought to deal with what we really are and with the ambiguity and anxiety and misery that attends it. Now, Sartre wants to take this a little bit further. He says, not only are we different from other human beings, but he creates a kind of sort of verbal formulas to describe it. And this is in, what's the book that was derived from Heidegger? This is in Being and Nothingness. Yes, Being and Nothingness is the kind of later extrapolation from Heidegger's Being and Time. And what he says is that there are two kinds of things, the things en soi and pour soi. In other words, the things in themselves and things for themselves. Objects like tables, chairs, cups of coffee, those are things in themselves. They are not conscious. They are objects. They are things. The alternative is things that are for themselves, pour soi. And what that means is conscious human subjects. Now, those of you who have been attentive to the earlier lectures will see this distinction between the world of nature, the world of senses, the world of objects, and the world of subjects as a revival of the old metaphysical distinction between things that have souls and things that don't. And notice that in a world purely made up of physical things, there will be no freedom. So Sartre just pounds the desk and insists that we're all free. And to be honest, although I'm not entirely convinced by the desk pounding, I think as a matter of practical everyday fact, we all experience the world as if we were making choices. And if we ever develop our physical science to the point where we believe, or we're willing to make the argument, that we don't really make any choices, that we don't have any freedom, Sartre says that that kind of science is really a way of escaping from the burden of making agonizing choices that have no fundamental ground. So Sartre says, like it or not, we are free. We can't get around that fact. That is the human condition. That's what it means to be a subject as opposed to an object. And the distinction between subjects and objects is what makes this is what makes Sartre's philosophy go. He says, what's it like to be a subject in the age we live in? In that respect, when he splits the world like this into subjects and objects, into minds and things, what he's doing is splitting the world the way Kant did. Do you remember the lecture on Kant where we talked about Kant's concern with moral freedom, with Kant's concern that human life and human subjectivity and the human psyche not be totally subsumed under the rubric of Newtonian mechanics? That's why he had to split the world into physics and metaphysics. Well, Sartre wants to do that without the metaphysics. Now, it's not entirely clear how we're going to get around to do that, of course. Certainly, the intellectual move that's going on there between splitting the world into subjects and objects seems suspiciously like that, but metaphysics has gone out of fashion. So we're going to have to kind of revoke its license to discuss these topics and instead try and reformulate these questions in ways that will make sense to the contemporary world. Kant had to reconcile moral theory with Newtonian mechanics. Sartre wants to reconcile his moral theory, and he has one, with the simple facts that the 20th century has been a dreadful, miserable, agonizing century, full of uncertainty, full of unpleasant activities, full of misery. Now, what's he going to do? Something like this. Instead of assuming the way Kant does, as one of the elements in his system, that God exists, Sartre is going to assume that God doesn't exist. And his argument will be something along these lines. People invent religious myths and religious illusions in order to relieve themselves of the burden of making decisions that have no ground. So if you can latch onto something that is apparently certain, like the Ten Commandments, you can avoid the necessity of deciding whether to kill or steal or commit adultery, all the things the Ten Commandments tells you not to do. So the reason why, in other words, in Sartre's view, that people invented religious systems and why they still gravitate towards them is that they are too inauthentic, is that they are too timid, that they're unwilling to grasp the fact that these things are just made up to alleviate our anxiety. And as soon as you realize that that's what they're made up to do, they no longer alleviate your anxiety. This has turned into a virtue. All right? So the agonizing qualities, the fact that there's no way out, to go for one of, or that there's no exit, that there's no way to avoid our freedom, is what Sartre is forcing us to consider. Now, not only is he going to leave out the idea of God, but he also says that there are other ways of avoiding the burden of freedom, and the terrible burden of freedom, the misery that accompanies it, the difficulties and the anguish that accompany it, push us towards avoiding it, but in order to be honest and authentic, in order to be at least what human beings could be, we have to confront the fact that we have to take our chances. Now consider his treatment of psychoanalysis. He says that psychoanalysis serves largely the same function that religious belief does. It allows you to attribute your behavior and your feelings and your connection to the world in a deterministic way that harks back to your child rearing and to your early experiences and such like things, and allows you to avoid taking responsibility for the choices that you make. In that respect, Sartre says that that sort of psychoanalysis is in fact an example of bad faith. It's you deceiving yourself so that you can give yourself a kind of respite from the difficulties that attend being a human being. So Sartre thinks that Freud, in that respect, has been one of the chief contributors to our self-deception, because he allows us to see the necessity of dealing with the fact that there are no rules, that there is no structure to the world, and that your behavior is not determined by your feelings for your mother. It's not determined by your weaning practices. It's not determined by anything like that. It's determined by you. It's determined by the world and your confrontation with the world. Responsibility rests with you, and it can never go away from you except at the cost of being less than you could be. In some respects, Sartre's treatment here is like that of the Greek myth in Prometheus. That is to say, he is a heroic, titanic figure that shakes his fist at the lack of meaning in the world, but won't invent some pseudo-solution to the problem. He says, freedom is the human condition and we must confront it. There are no moral rules, but at least there could be moral heroism. Heroism in the face of meaninglessness and chaos. And if you stop and think about his novels, and not just his novels, but the novels of almost all the existentialist writers, what they are talking about is moral heroism in the face of moral chaos. That's the main theme in this strand of existentialism. Now, Sartre in some respects bears comparison with Spinoza. The reason why is the following. Spinoza believed that there was absolutely no human freedom. If you remember Professor Staloff's lecture on Spinoza, a beautiful job that he did, he said the world, according to Spinoza, is entirely deterministic. The reason why is that because God is free, completely free. And if God is free, there can't be anything else free in the world, because it would limit and get in the way of his freedom. Since God's freedom is absolute, we are all essentially mechanical, automatons. And we follow the same necessary causal connections that everything else in the world does. In other words, the universe is too small for more than one free thing. And in Spinoza's case, since he's going to be a religious believer, he wants to hold on to the idea of God, human freedom goes by the board. Sartre is going to turn that on its head. He's going to say, I refuse to accept religious belief because there can only be one free thing in the world, and it's people, not God. If God did exist, he would in fact limit our freedom. And the fact that he would be free would prevent us from being free. Spinoza was right. And if we're going to be free and authentic and confront what we really are, God's got to go. He's in our way. And that's the ground of his argument. He's going to take Spinoza's determinism and undetermine it. And if it means we have to get rid of God, he'll ruthlessly get rid of that as well as everything else. So God gets in our way. If he existed, he would step on our toes. So Sartre decided to get rid of him. And it comes out to be a sort of lonely heroism which doesn't accept any of the preset formulas, but which doesn't really offer any set formulas of its own. To go back to Wittgenstein a little bit, the only thing that holds existentialism together is that they have a rough family resemblance. Strictly speaking, there are no existentialist dogmas. The more you dogmatize, the less of an existentialist you are. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't dogmatize, right? When Sartre tells you that you ought to be authentic, he can never really account for why. Because his moral judgments, if you stop and think about it, really don't apply to you. What this ends up being is a kind of hymn to being free. It's a poem in praise of freedom. It's a kind of encomium in the strict Greek sense of the term, a speech in praise of what it means to be an authentic, free individual, of what it means to be at least heroic if you can't be good. That's the best we can do according to Sartre. And not just him. There are no existentialist dogmas. They say that there are no universal rules which apply to everyone. And that's why existentialists have so little in common. For a set of family resemblances, this family doesn't resemble one another all that much. There are existentialist atheists like Sartre and Heidegger, but there are also existentialist religious believers. Paul Tillich was very influenced by Heidegger's Being in Time. Karl Jaspers, the great German philosopher of existence, was in fact a religious believer. Gabriel Marcel in France is a religious existentialist. The problem is, we're playing tennis with the net down. If you want to be a religious existentialist, you can do that. If you want to be some other kind of existentialist, you can be that. There are no rules, so you can make it up as you go along. And if you want to change your mind later on, well, it may be authentic, it may be not. Maybe you want to be authentic, maybe you don't. We're playing tennis with the net down. And insofar as this gives us pause to consider what we thought we were certain of, it's probably salutary. Insofar as it makes us conscious of what the potential of human beings really is, I think it's desirable. But insofar as it amounts to moral nihilism, it is extremely dangerous. It is one of the most dangerous tendencies of this century. In terms of politics, once we have lost the possibility of an ethical theory, haven't we also lost the idea of a universal political theory? Doesn't this mean that we subjectivize all our judgments not just of moral order, but correspondingly of political order? Sartre fought the Nazis, or at least he said he did, when he was working during the Second World War. Heidegger put on the swastika and gave a truly rousing speech about the future of the university under the new Reich in 1936. Now, please don't make any kind of pedestrian moral comments about this. We're beyond that. We're involved with Dasein. And that means it's okay to be a Nazi because, well, there really aren't any rules left. The problem is that if we want to make moral judgments about this, there are two kinds we can make. We can make our own subjective moral judgments and say, like, I don't like that, which is analogous to saying, I don't like the taste of broccoli, or blue is my favorite color. The only difficulty there is that there are as many answers to whether Nazism is good as there are people who want to answer the question. If we claim people to make universal moral judgments about this, then we're no longer existentialists. You have to take it or leave it. The problem here is that when we end up completely subjectivizing morals, correspondingly we completely subjectivize our conception of politics. And when we do that, what is it that they say? Some writer once said that the sleep of reason produces monsters. The problem is that we're left without any weapon to combat the nihilistic and genocidal tendencies of this age. When technology is developed to the point that it has, that we can bureaucratize and routinize genocide, what is it that correspondingly allows us to use this technology, which allows us to use this control over nature in ways that might be described as good? Well, for the existentialist, that's an old-fashioned question. It indicates that you're a philosophical pedestrian. It indicates that you're a tourist, that you don't understand Dasein or some such thing. Be authentic and flip a coin, figure it out one way or another. It's as much a series of problems as it is a series of solutions. As a matter of fact, it's a philosophical stance which says that there are no solutions, and that's the solution. It comes very close to being talking to oneself, hymns to subjectivity, and little else. And here's the kind of scorpion tail at the end of our consideration here, something worth thinking through. Existentialism is primarily a literary movement. If you want to read good examples of existentialism, read something like Samuel Beckett or Andre Malraux or Camus, The Myth of Sisyphus, something like that. It does a very effective job of talking about the kind of themes that are common in existentialism, and it does it more effectively than most of the rigorous or would-be rigorous philosophical work on account of the fact that this is essentially poetry, that this is not any kind of logical description of the world, because they're more or less unconcerned with that. And I'm not certain, and I strongly suspect that there is no universal logical vocabulary which will allow us to discuss the internal contents of our psyche. Think about the problem that Wittgenstein raised. How will we know what it's like to have other people's experiences? The only way we can do it is through works of imaginative literature. We may be willing to say that that's what literature is for. And the advantage of existentialism is that it is a poetic revolt against the logicizing and scientizing tendencies in Anglo-American philosophy. The defect of it is that there are as many existentialists or as many existentialist views as there are existentialists. And what that means is that we're essentially playing tennis with the net down. Everything is in. So then our only standard ends up being, what is it that's moving? What is it that really is attractive about the way in which we articulate our predicament? And the more entertaining and attractive articulations are the ones that form the corpus of existentialist literature. As Samuel Beckett says in Endgame, we're not beginning to mean anything, are we? Those of you who have seen Endgame understand what the existentialist predicament is. We're sitting here waiting for something to happen, and maybe it will, maybe it won't. But even if it does, we won't understand it. Or there'll be as many understandings as there are understanders. And the problem is that we lapse into a kind of subjectivity which almost denies the possibility of communicating altogether. The communication that existentialist novels and existentialist plays usually engage in is in fact a sort of poetic communication. What's important about the kind of poetry, and that's what I would call it, that they produce is more the connotations than the denotations. Logical positivists want to free us from the ambiguity of language. The existentialists bask in it. What they want us to do is to become heroic, even if we can't become perfect, if we can't become rational, if we can't become Socratic in that respect. Or perhaps what Socratism leads to in this century is the kind of valuation of ambiguity, which says the best we can do is at least bravely confront the uncertainty that we have around us. And the reason why this is derived from the 19th century should be worth your consideration. It seems to me that there is a connection between this tendency in 20th century Western thought and the romanticism of the early 19th century. Think of the sort of themes that come in during the early 19th century. The heroic individual fighting against the mass, the hatred of science and technology, the rejection of logic and reason and certainty in favor of sentiment, in favor of emotion, in favor of intuition, in favor of subjectivity. If romantic literature and romantic poetry and romantic music and romantic art emphasize subjectivity, emphasize heroism, emphasize uncertainty, emphasize the lack or the limitations of human rationality, what existentialism does in the 20th century is revive that tendency with a vengeance. And that accounts, I think, at least in part, for why the Romantic era, the first half of the 19th century, is so noteworthy for its outstanding artistic production, and yet it produces very little in the realm of science or rational inquiry. It's not a great age for science. On the other hand, the late part of the 19th century, in fact, does something like that, moves away from subjectivity towards science and objectivity. When that collapses, due in large part to the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, that great titan of subjectivity, what we get left with is a revival of romanticism. Be heroic if you can't be certain. Be anguished if you can't be smug. At least do something interesting. Don't evade the question. The question is, how can I become a real human individual? And isn't that what somebody like Dickens demands that we do? Sentiment over science, feeling over reason. In fact, the despair about the reasoning capacities of human beings is what is most characteristic of the literary and philosophical trend we call existentialism. And if, in fact, it isn't entirely satisfactory as a set of answers, because, in fact, it's too vague and nebulous, the questions that it asks of us are worthwhile, and if they don't ultimately make you better, at least the attempt to deal with these questions will make you no worse. And if it deepens your soul without costing you a conception of objectivity and the real world, then you can both avoid solipsism and avoid being a Philistine. You can actually be a real human being. What the existentialists demand that we do is that we live up to the limited, inadequate, and unsatisfactory potentials of being a human being in an age of science and a world of machines. If it's not entirely satisfactory as a philosophy, it is at least a significant and sincere cry of the heart. It is a lament of exasperation at the difficulties in being a person in a world that is almost entirely depersonalized. It's an advocacy of the poetic over the rational, and this is a tendency of philosophy and culture because it's a tendency in the human psyche. And until we develop the mind of God and the certainty of God, the possibility and the importance of this tendency is going to be with us.